This is the voice of Russia.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna. Today our studio discussion is on the protests that have spread across the Muslim world over a US-made film insulting the Prophet Muhammad. Those protests have now been going on for 10 days. The first began in Cairo, then the unrest spread to Libya. That cost the US ambassador, Christopher Stevens, his life. Protests spread to Yemen, Sudan and Tunisia. Just today, more violent scenes have been reported in Pakistan, the Philippines and Malaysia. Exacerbating the anger is the publication in a French satirical magazine of cartoons mocking the Prophet Muhammad. So are we now witnessing a fundamental rift between the West and its values, which says free speech is paramount, and the Islamic world, which says insults against religion should not be tolerated? Joining me for today's discussion is Charlie Wolf, an American broadcaster who blogs for the Daily Mail. Rodney Shakespeare is co-founder of the Global Justice Movement. Baig is a freelance journalist and filmmaker. And joining us on the phone is Dr. Robert Barnidge, a lecturer of law at the University of Reading. I'll begin with you, Baig. Is this a protest, a clash between two fundamentally different worldviews?
I don't think it is. I don't think we can frame it in that sense. I think what we're seeing here is a reaction to American imperialism and Western imperialism, because these actions, these cartoons are done by individuals, this film is done by an individual, a filmmaker, and obviously a provocation. But the protesters are saying what on the streets of Libya or Pakistan? They're saying death to America. And whether we like it or not, whether America likes it or not, they're seen as, a Satan. They've bombed Iraq, occupied Afghanistan. And in the Muslim world, this is just the straw that breaks the camel's back. It's not that Muslims can't take criticism of Islam. There's been criticism over the centuries, academic criticism. People can enter dialogue and discussion and debate. But these are purely insults based on racism and Islamophobia. I think that's the reaction that we're seeing.
Charlie Wolf, do you agree with that?
No, not totally. I agree with your opening statements. I don't think this had anything to do with the films. I think if you look specifically at Libya, that was a planned attack by Al-Qaeda. So that had nothing to do with films or anything other than a power struggle, either on the Libyan stage, and also I'd say there's a tug of war going between the Al-Qaeda and the Salafists in Egypt as well. But I think what's going on here is you have a lot of propaganda within a country or within the Muslim world, again, used by Al-Qaeda and others who use their own people. People are kept down, and the best way to keep leaders in power who are robbing their people, who are mismanaging their people, etc., is you find a bogeyman. And in this case, it's very easy to look at the United States or Israel, prop them up as the bogeyman, and that creates the protests in the street. So I think a lot of this actually goes back to the original Bush doctrine, who said that people who are free and have free speech, etc., who have better economic conditions, are not going to fall for this sort of propaganda and will not be fighting with the United States. There's no reason. I don't think there is a clash of cultures. I may not believe in Islam per se, but I respect anyone else's right to believe it, as long as they respect my right to believe my religion. But these countries have been in a state where it's not been easy. They've had dictators, they've had thugs and criminals. If you want to look at, for instance, Hamas ruling the Gaza Strip, and I think there's a lot of that which is going on.
Rodney Shakespeare.
War was declared on Islam at roughly 4:45 in the afternoon of 9/11, when a British journalist, Jane Stanley, reported, and she was reading from a piece of paper given to her by Reuters, that Tower Number 7, which had not been hit by a plane, had in fact collapsed in its own footprint into smithereens. And yet, as she was speaking, you could see from the camera into the background that the building was still standing. It was another half an hour before that building was blown up by demolition. The truth about 9/11 was that the Americans and the Israelis knew that something was happening. They let it happen, and they made sure it did happen in a big way.
But if we bring this back to the protests...
They did that because war was declared on Islam on that day. It has continued since then in the form of ordinary wars, propaganda, and if I may just say in respect of Charlie, I found his remarks about Islam patronising, because one of the problems of
Rodney, if we bring this back to the centre of the discussion, we're looking at the protests and whether the protests are a clash between these two cultures.
Well, I'm telling you that war was in fact was started on 2001, and it is continuing. So it is a war by one side against other nations, and the war is intended to ensure that they do not have the strength to stand up against an expanding Zionist entity.
Can I come in here, please?
Yeah, let's bring in Dr. Robert Barnidge, lecturer of law at the University of Reading.
First of all, I'd like to respond to Assad that Islam can't take criticism of Islam, or Muslims cannot take criticism of Islam. I think with all the provocations, all the violent protests we see, and of course that Islamic law does allow for apostasy, one can simply look at the case of Salman Rushdie as an example that many Muslims cannot take criticism of Islam. I don't think this is a case of racism or Islamophobia. I'm not even sure what Islamophobia means, quite frankly, because it seems quite contradictory to what you said about not being able to take criticism of Islam. And secondly, when it comes to this what you were alluding to about imperialism and root causes, I would advise all listeners to look at the letter to America from bin Laden from November 2002. And it's very clear. He puts out about 7 points: homosexuality, not converting to Islam, intoxication, fornication, and if you do not reverse America, your policies with regards to these, then prepare for a fight with the Islamic nation. So I think it's very clear that when we talk about imperialism and so on and so forth, militant Islam has a very, very clear credo. And unless those are met, those 7 points from November 2002, then there will be perpetual war with the Islamic nation.
This is the voice of Russia.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna. Today our studio discussion is on the protests that have spread across the Muslim world over a US-made film insulting the Prophet Muhammad. Joining me for today's discussion is Charlie Wolf, an American broadcaster who blogs for the Daily Mail. Rodney Shakespeare is co-founder of the Global Justice Movement. Baig is a freelance journalist and filmmaker. And joining us on the phone is Dr. Robert Barnidge, a lecturer of law at the University of Reading. Let's bring in Baig here. How do Islamic countries view the Western protection of this doctrine of freedom of speech, the doctrine that has allowed these films and these cartoons to be published?
I'd like to respond first. I think it's very convenient for some people to portray Islam as bin Laden on one side and the West with all their values on the other, and I don't think it's that simple. Bin Laden is not a representative of the Muslim world, and actually Islam can take criticism. I don't know if the lecturer there has ever lived in the Muslim world. I have. I've lived in Syria. I've travelled in Mauritania, Morocco, throughout the Muslim world. And actually, academic criticism, actual debate and discussion is something else. When you start using words like the crusade, for justice or whatever, and you bring up history, the historical context of this, then Muslims will get upset. And this cartoon and this film isn't a criticism of Islam. It's an insult. It's a provocation. Salman Rushdie, in his book, put the wives of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in a brothel. Now, that's not a criticism. That's not academic criticism. That's not that is an insult.
And let's bring in Charlie Wolf here. Charlie,
listen. I as a Jew, deal with coming from certain Islamics, not all of Islam by a far stretch, but certain segments that Jews are the sons of apes and pigs and blood libels, etc. I don't go protesting in the street. I don't go crazy in the street demanding people's head. I'll give you a great example. Brett Stevens was talking about this in the Wall Street Journal about how Christians, I'll say radical Muslims and Mormons deal with this sort of thing. You've got the play, The Book of Mormon, on Broadway right now, where all the liberal elite have gone to see this film, highly insulting to that church. Yet their response, actually, funny enough, and I think it's a lesson to all of us, they actually took an advert out in the back of the playbill that says, "You've seen the play, now read the book."
I think that's slightly different. I think the position you're coming from is like, look, as Christians, as Jews, and as people in the West, look how civilized we are. When we have criticism, well, we just take out an advert or we write an article. Let's look at the Muslim world. Look at the disproportionality of power, resources, and the oppression of what's taking place. Muslims they see the world as a large brotherhood. They have a link with Muslims across the world from other countries. Now, when they see the bombing of Gaza, when they see the occupation of Iraq, when they see the occupation of Afghanistan, when they see the daily demonization of Muslims in every part of the media, from politicians to journalists to whoever in books and films, there's going to be a reaction. Now,
Charlie, are we in danger of exaggerating this? Are we in danger of exaggerating these protests? There is only a small proportion of these very large Muslim countries who are getting violent over this.
I agree with you. It is a very small proportion. But again, you're talking about the bombing of Gaza. Let's not forget that there's a situation going on because of terrorist attacks from Gaza. So it's not that simple.
Homemade rockets.
Well, I don't care what you want to call them. A rocket is still a rocket. Again, you've got Hamas sitting there talking about death to all Jews. You look at the Hamas charter. We will not negotiate with anybody. If there's a tree and it says "Jew behind me, stone the Jew," etc. They're still throwing rockets over the border. And you're talking about reacting.
Okay, let's bring in Dr. Robert Barnidge. We're going to go to the lecturer of law at the University of Reading, Dr. Robert Barnidge.
Well, yeah, look, where's the thanks from the so-called Muslim world for the liberation of Iraq, the liberation of Afghanistan? When has the Muslim world ever been able to countenance peace with Israel, two-state solution? They've always rejected it.
Sorry, can I come back on that? Sorry,
let Dr. Barnidge have his say.
Perpetual victimhood, and I think Charlie is very right to refer to the Hadith, which is cited in the Muslim charter, or the Hamas charter, which of course Hamas is an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood, that calls for the killing, and the end of the world won't come until all the Jews are killed. That has never been disavowed by any Muslim Brotherhood spokespeople. That's a very, very vile.
But Dr. Barnidge, do you accept that Muslims have the right to be offended by these cartoons?
I'm offended every day, but I don't go out and kill people.
Yes, but if I could come in there, we've had mention of advertisements, and this shows the sort of thing which goes on. On the New York subway, there is now an advertisement which reads as follows: "In any war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man, support Israel, and defeat jihad." And there you have it in a nutshell.
Yeah, but
I haven't finished my sentence, Charlie. Charlie, this is a big studio, but you just keep down until I finish my next sentence. It is a mindset which actually wishes to demonize Islam. And of course, this is part of a whole process of ensuring that Islam is kept down, it is in fact suppressed, and each individual nation is stopped from becoming sufficiently strong.
How many billions
Let me finish the sentence. Sufficiently strong to oppose the Zionist entity's expansion. Over to you, Charlie.
There's 10 million Jews in the world and several billion, or at least 1.5 billion?
1.6 billion.
1.6 billion Muslims in the world. The largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia. You've got the Islamic Republic of Iran, Islamic republics. I don't think the Muslim world is being put down and not succeeding. Muslims live very happily in America. You can look at the stats from crimes. There was a very small peak after 9/11. Crimes against Muslims have decreased, nowhere near the crimes against Jews, homosexuals, etc. in New York City, according to FBI stats. So, so there's an advert on the subway. But wait, there's an advert on the subway, and I guess the question I have, and I say this in all honesty, what sort of constitution does Islam have if an advert on a subway or a guy making a cheap film that was laughable, tears the religion apart? I have a bit. Again, I'm not trying to make this as a personal attack, but you know what I'm saying? In a friendly way, I'm saying I don't let my Judaism or people's Christianity, that gets attacked daily, doesn't get destroyed because of some idiotic film.
No, but look, there's a number of points I want to address here. First is the point from the lecture. Where's the thanks from the Muslim world? Okay, maybe the Muslim world should thank the West for colonizing their country, supporting those very dictators, drawing lines in their maps, then funding the dictators and funding militias.
But what we're talking about here
democracy. But I want to get back to the
adverts. We're talking about the films. This is a freedom of speech which Western countries enshrine in their doctrines.
The lecturer and the Charlie said that they don't get offended. Well, I'm a Muslim.
No, I do get offended, but I don't react to it in such a way.
I'm a Muslim. I was offended. I didn't react. I didn't kill anybody. So I can sit there just like you.
Yeah.
However, what I'm saying is try to understand where this anger and this frustration is coming from. And it's not about a clash of values. It's about the oppressed and the oppressor. The oppressor, which is seen as America and the West, has on a daily basis, is occupying people's countries, is bombing people in Afghanistan. And not only that, it's taking their resources. And when you have a class of people that are oppressed, they don't have the same right to education, they don't have the same right to their resources or health or anything else, and then the final straw is, hold on, you attack something very sacred to them.
Straw.
If there's something very sacred, they will react and they will protest. The majority of the Muslims in the world have protested without violence. But it's also a final point is the double standards coming in here, because when the Libyan rebels were protesting using arms, America was praising them. The Syrians are fighting back with arms and they're praising them and saying, oh, these are revolutionaries, and they're supporting to train them and arming them. But when Muslims throw rocks and burn a building then, and you start calling it violent and a clash of values, I think there's double standards here, and I think it's an ideological one from the other members on this panel.
This is the voice of Russia.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna. Today our studio discussion is on the protests that have spread across the Muslim world over a US-made film insulting the Prophet Muhammad. Joining me for today's discussion is Charlie Wolf, an American broadcaster who blogs for the Daily Mail. Rodney Shakespeare is co-founder of the Global Justice Movement. Baig is a freelance journalist and filmmaker. And joining us on the phone is Dr. Robert Barnidge, a lecturer of law at the University of Reading. Dr. Barnidge, if we come to you now, many European countries have restrictions on freedom of speech, and they're willing to contemplate prosecuting people who might insult footballers or divers on Twitter. So why shouldn't religion get the same protection?
Well, let me answer that in a second. But Assad had mentioned something about the oppression and so on, and the reaction of the Muslims to this. I mean, when is the last? I think there's something ideological to the reaction to being offended, because when is the last time Tibetans blew themselves up in front of Chinese consulates or Chinese embassies, or committed acts of violence? Second point, going back to the question. The second point, going back to the question, is this is political speech. I think religions and political doctrines, free flow of ideas, marketplace of ideas, and I see religion should be criticized, politics should be criticized, ideological framework should be criticized, and that's the whole point of having freedom of speech.
I don't have a problem with criticism. We're not talking about criticism here. We're talking about blatant provocation and insults. For example, if I criticize you about the work that you do, or your academia, or your political views, that's a criticism. I don't expect anything. I don't expect a violent reaction. But if I take your house, I make you live in the garden, you have restricted access, and on top of that, rather than criticize you, I slander you and swear at you every day. If you turn around and punch me in my face, it's kind of understandable. I'm not saying I agree with that action, but I kind of understand why it's come about. I think that's what you're seeing in the Muslim world. You've oppressed people, you've occupied their countries, you restrict their access, you restrict their resources, and now they burn down a building, and we're having this massive discussion about a clash of values. It's not a clash of values, it's about one side is oppressing the other, and people are reacting.
Charlie Wolf, this is not about a clash of values, says Assad.
Well, I go back to my original point. I think, it's a use of propaganda by people that are controlling countries and controlling people. Again, I look at Hamas. Hamas have been stealing from their people. So is the PA, quite frankly. Arafat was doing it for years, and it's great. Have a boogeyman, call it Israel, get them protesting in the streets. And meanwhile, Assad, Suha Arafat's living very nicely on the Champs-Élysées right now with money that should belong to the Palestinians.
So there is a worry here, isn't there, that there might be some evidence that for example, Salafists trying to show that they're anti-American, that these protests are being hijacked almost for political ends.
The majority of the people on the streets right now in Pakistan, all over the world, are not Salafis. And I think, again, it's convenient for the West to create this boogeyman of the Salafists, that they're such extremists. They don't hold
it's not
massive
just them.
sway.
Is there a concern? Is there a worry that these protests are being hijacked for political ends?
I think a protest in and of itself is political. And the way that a crowd moves, it's not dictated by Salafis. We're not seeing leaders come out of these protests. The same crowds were demonstrating in Egypt when Mubarak was overthrown. We didn't, we weren't talking about Salafists then. The same crowds were celebrating in Libya, but the Salafists in Libya were actually supported by the West, and they don't see a problem there when they're arming the rebels in Libya. For example, Syria, Salafists from Qatar and Saudi are coming in to Syria and armed and trained by the West. The Wahhabi state of Saudi Arabia and Qatar are Wahhabi Salafis, supported and best friends with the West. There doesn't seem to be a clash of civilizations or values there. Sorry, but that's okay because they're our friends, right?
Yes, the hypocrisy coming from, I think, Charlie and Robert, is absolutely amazing. From Robert, we're being told that America stands for liberty and democracy, and at the same time, it is supporting the Salafis, the Wahhabists, the Saudis, the sexual perverts. The Saudis are, they like whipping women, the killer caliphs in Bahrain, or those autocrats in the Persian Gulf countries. As for Charlie, he dares to talk about Hamas and its alleged aggression. Israel is in fact occupying and expanding in its settlements right the way through the occupied territories, totally against all the United Nations. All the United Nations motions. Let me finish the sentence. And it is an absolutely shocking thing that the USA and the UK and France and Canada are supporting an aggressive, expanding Zionist entity.
Right. Well, first off, they're not expanding or occupying any inch of Gaza. And the minute they went out, what did Hamas do when they took over? First off, they destroyed all the infrastructure that was left back for the people, and then they started shooting rockets off. As to the West Bank, those are disputed territories. They're not occupied territories. And once they sit down at the peace table, there is a final step.
Disputed.
That's
they are occupied.
They are officially. Disputed. If you go to the United Nations, even though
you
they don't
should go to the United Nations resolutions,
is officially calls it disputed. I know they don't seem to use the term anymore themselves, but officially it is disputed, and it is. Wait a minute.
This is preposterous.
It is not preposterous. It is disputed territory that is supposed to be negotiated in a final status agreement. Any of the so-called expansion of settlements has been in Jewish areas.
This is the voice of Russia.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Cinna. Today our studio discussion is on the protests that have spread across the Muslim world over a US-made film insulting the Prophet Muhammad. Joining me for today's discussion is Charlie Wolf, an American broadcaster who blogs for the Daily Mail. Rodney Shakespeare is co-founder of the Global Justice Movement. Baig is a freelance journalist and filmmaker. And joining us on the phone is Dr. Robert Barnidge, a lecturer of law at the University of Reading. Policymakers have tried all sorts of things in the Middle East. They've tried spreading democracy from the heavy approach of Iraq to the lighter approach of Libya and staying out altogether of some other countries. Do you think, Charlie Wolf, it's now time for them to stop?
No, I think that, if you look at, for instance, Afghanistan, George Bush took quite a risk when he went. We could have, and many conservatives and many on the right said, what we should have done with the Taliban, we should have gone in, bombed them from the air, been done with it and left. But instead, George Bush put a lot of money, a lot of treasure, a lot of lives in there to try and bring freedom. And if you look at metrics, it ain't perfect in Afghanistan by a long shot, and I think Mr. Obama has a lot to answer for. And also the same with Iraq. Iraq has a constitution now. It ain't perfect. It ain't France, it ain't Sweden or Switzerland or what have you, but it's in a far better state than it was. And again, it's better than having just gone in. If we were imperialists, we would have just gone in, leveled it, and been done with it and said, okay, the threat is gone. We would have left until the threat came back and bombed it again. We didn't.
Do you think we're now, Baig, do you think we are now going to see a change in US policy?
No, I think the US policy hasn't changed. I think that US policy, if you look at their treatment of Latin America, how they've supported military coups there and how they've gone in with the military. If you look at Afghanistan, look, they did bomb and flatten Afghanistan, and then they put their troops on the ground, and now they realize it's not just the Taliban that they're fighting the Afghan people who don't want an occupying force there. Afghanistan isn't in a better position than it was before. Iraq isn't in a better position as it was before. We saw an increase in sectarian violence. We saw lies told to American people about Al-Qaeda being there, and actually Al-Qaeda entered after the Americans were there. We have a deeply segregated country, and now we're talking about war with Iran. I think, look, America doesn't spread freedom. America looks for new marketplaces. It wants to make money. War makes money, and money makes people in America, the corporations and these people, bigwigs, very happy. So, and also I think that American policy, if it actually was for freedom, then they would have recognized the Palestinians' right. When they voted for Hamas, they recognized the Hamas as the legitimate government of Palestine.
Let's bring in Dr. Robert Barnidge. We haven't heard from you for a while, lecturer of law at the University of Reading.
Yeah, I kind of got cut off from the phone there. Assad, Hamas should have never been recognized. They should never have been able to run in the elections, because the whole structure of having elections was, in 1993, they had to recognize the right of Israel to exist. And only the parties that recognize the right of Israel to exist would be able to run in the elections. That's the whole point of having Palestinian representation. And so
who gives you the right to dictate what democracy is? I don't understand. On one hand, you say you give the right to people to vote, and when they vote for somebody you don't like,
a lot more than simply voting.
And you say, look, actually,
no. It's not
no.
a democratic organization. It's an extremist organization. I mean, would you say that the Muslim Brotherhood is an extremist
organization? I would say America. Many of the American politicians are extremists. I think the American political system is an extremist organization. Come on, look at Romney. He doesn't represent 46% of the people.
Dr. Barnidge,
I think obviously, okay, two comments on that. One about America, one about France. First comment is, I think there was a very unfortunate cable that came out of the Cairo embassy, essentially apologizing for this. The United States government is not responsible. This is freedom of expression, and the United States government should not apologize for or in any way comment upon the freedom of speech of its particular nationals. Second point is, I think it's very unfortunate, quite courageous actually, Charlie Hebdo lambasted all sorts of organizations, Islam, the Catholic Church, et cetera, and a lot of it's in poor taste, including about Islam. But I think it's unfortunate that the French have shut down a lot of their consulates and embassies in Muslim-majority countries. They have an obligation to protect the interest of their French nationals in those countries, and I think it's unfortunate. They should have reinforced the security around their embassies and consulates, because otherwise it gives the wrong impression, which is that violence pays.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for today's discussion on the protests that have spread across the Muslim world over a US-made video insulting the Prophet Muhammad. Thank you to all of my guests. Charlie Wolfe, an American broadcaster who blogs for the Daily Mail. Rodney Shakespeare is the co-founder of the Global Justice Movement. Assad Baig is a freelance journalist and filmmaker. And joining us on the phone was Dr. Robert Barnidge, a lecturer of law at the University of Reading. You've been listening to The Voice of Russia in London. If you have any comments on today's discussion, email uk@ruvr.ru, or to listen again, head to our website, ruvr.co.uk. The news is next.
This is The Voice of Russia. The London Bureau of The Voice of Russia is now live on digital radio and online. For news, comment and debate, tune in on weekdays between 3 and 7 p.m.